blend between, you know, Zoom and live webinars. And chances are all of our all of our live seminars will probably be broadcast as webinars as well. So yeah, this is very, very cool. Well, I'm going to probably get this going. A couple of people from Wisconsin. Great, 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 great. Well, this should be a pretty cool presentation. We always try and come up with something a little bit different, so you know you get something new from this. And tonight about troubleshooting in the field, I think is going to be a pretty good presentation. All righty. Got about 27 alarms going off here telling me it's time to start, and it's time to start. And I think with the number of people that we have here, we're going to get started. So again, hello everyone. My name is Jim Reisman. I run NiSi Optics USA in the United States. I'm based in Los Angeles, and very often during our webinars, I will have a speaker from somewhere around the country or sometimes even out of the country. But I've got my old pal, oh, Gino, if I could ask you to turn off your camera. I've got my old pal, Ewen Crosby here, who is nearby in basically in the Long Beach, California area, which is about 35, 40 minutes south of LAX. So he's nearby. He was actually the very first person who did a webinar for us way back probably in November or December of 2019, before the lockdown happened. He actually came over to the office, but now he'll be doing a webinar from home, which is just fine. As previous viewers of our webinars know, every time we do a webinar, we also offer to the people who have registered a discount code to give you 15% off of virtually everything that is NiSi. The only thing we have to exclude is our 15 millimeter f4 Sunstar lens, because we just can't afford to give 15% off on that. But everything else, our V6 holders, all of our filters, both our round threaded filters and our square and rectangular filters are all 15% off. Our close-up lens, our incredible macro rail. And if it's been a while since you've tuned into a NiSi webinar, we also have a new brand. And the brand is Explorer Photo and Video. Now this is a new brand. We only have about 17 products so far, but the line will be expanding throughout the year. But right now what we have that's really notable is we have a really good $99 LED light with 4.5 hours of full power life in it. So if any of you do any wedding or event photography, it's great for that. It's also great for people in the field. And it also works as a power pack for your phone, or you need to power up your iPad or something. It's got a 6,000 milliamp battery. We also have an L bracket so that you can turn your camera quickly vertical. We have it universal, and we also have a custom one for the Canon R5 and R6. We have great little compact tripods, ball heads, lots of little accessories. Definitely worth checking it out. And for now, until April 4th, you can use this code and get 15% off of that as well. So I am going to have Chris take over the screen sharing and run with it. I will be monitoring the chat during his webinar, so I will try my best to answer questions as they come in. And if I feel I need to pop in on Chris and ask him a question, I will, but I'm going to try and really keep that to a dead minimum. And at the end of the webinar, I'll be happy to let people go on live and ask questions live. But for right now, let's keep it to chat, and let's please keep our cameras and our microphones off. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Jim, and so happy to be back with you guys once again. As Jim alluded to in his introduction, did a webinar for NiSi back in late last year, and it's been a few months, and I'm just glad to be back sharing some of my insights from the field with you guys. And today's webinar, Troubleshooting Landscape Photography, is kind of neat because I get to share some of the stuff that you really don't get to hear about as much in some webinars, because you hear a lot of the same things. And hopefully today you'll hear some of the behind the scenes things and some of the things that are going to get you through some of those tough situations, be it bad weather or equipment failures or just common things that I see from my students that are trouble for them. So hopefully you learn some things that will help you in the field the next time you go out, and maybe give you a different perspective and some new insights to include into your arsenal of photography skills. So before we get started, a little bit about me. Jim said that I was in the Los Angeles area. This is true. I'm just south of him. Born and raised in Seal Beach, California, currently residing in Long Beach, California, which is actually just a few miles north. They border each other. So I haven't moved far from home, been stuck in the sea air, I guess, and the Southern California sunsets. And it's hard for me to get away and to move on. So been in this area all my life, but definitely did a lot of exploring in my youth and throughout my early adulthood. I did a lot of things outdoor as well as sports. You name a sport and I've probably played it in some fashion. I've done baseball, soccer, played golf, rode dirt bikes, rollerbladed, skateboarded, surfed, did a lot of surfing actually. As growing up in Seal Beach, that was the main thing to do. So did a lot of things outdoor, but then also went on a lot of adventures with my family. We were lucky to be able to go up to the Eastern Sierras a couple times of the year, both in the winter to go skiing and then in the summer to go camping. And this developed a love for the outdoors as I grew into an adult. And that never has really left me. I've just always loved being outdoors, loved being outside, exploring different places and seeing the beautiful parts of the world that we have out there, especially in the state of California. I didn't pick up photographing really until 2009. I was doing a lot of hiking outside of, here locally in California, or Southern California, I should say, in the San Gabriel Mountains, and just doing a lot of hiking for exercise and just for adventure, and decided that, hey, it'd be nice to capture some of these views that I was seeing. And at the time, of course, cell phone cameras were pretty pathetic, so needed to buy a DSLR. My brother had been pushing me to do it. He'd had a camera for a few years. And so I went ahead and bought the same camera he did, because it was what I was familiar with, and started messing around with it. Didn't take it very seriously at first. It was more of a, I was shooting in program mode and didn't really know what I was doing. And had a friend and a roommate who kind of rekindled that fire in 2013. And I kind of re-sparked the interest in photography for me, and got real serious with it. And then by 2017, I was getting requests to start teaching others what I was doing. I guess I had learned a lot by just absorbing a lot of information, listening to a lot of other photographers, meeting photographers, researching online, and photography had improved, and people started asking unsolicited, can you show me what you're doing? And I said, oh, well, that'd be awesome. That sounds good. Eventually it turned into a business that I could sustain myself with, and I decided to jump ship in 2018 and become a full-time professional. And I've been doing that ever since and have loved it. And the rest is kind of history, I guess you would say. So it's been an interesting journey. Didn't really think I'd end up in photography when I was younger, but I'm really not surprised that I'm here. Real fast, just a couple companies that I've worked with. Of course, NiSi is a great partner of mine. I've really enjoyed our relationship, and they've been real good to me, as well as my clients that I have in my workshops, and providing them with equipment and giving them discounts and all these sort of things. They've been awesome. Their team over there, I mean, anytime I have a problem with a client order, they're right on top of it faster than I can be on top of it. So they're awesome. But I've been lucky to work with all of these companies that you see listed here in some capacity, either as an ambassador or working, creating content. So let's get down to the content. What you're really here to hear from me, really. And the first thing I'd like to talk about in troubleshooting landscape photography is really troubleshooting the weather, because weather is so instrumental in landscape photography. Yes, you can get great landscape photos without great weather, but really weather is what makes a great landscape photo. This same photo that you see on the screen here from Yosemite Valley wouldn't be the same unless it was covered in snow with a angry sky. If it was just the green trees and the bluebird sky, well, yeah, I mean, El Capitan is magnificent, the valley's magnificent, but what really shows the character of this valley is having that atmosphere and those clouds. So atmosphere is super important in landscape photography. It helps provide texture. It helps to provide a mood to the scene, gives context a lot of the time to what goes on in that environment. Like Yosemite Valley, for example, how it just breathes and as the air flows and the moisture evaporates and all these things are happening. It's like a big churning cloud dryer, I guess you would say. So atmosphere, very important to landscape photography, and you got to have it. You got to look for it, and you have to be there when that atmosphere is happening. One thing weather will do is to help to frame your subjects better. This photo from the Eastern Sierras is an old cabin that rests there, and I think it's been there for at least 70 to 100 years, but it just sits here deteriorating, and it's really framed well by the interesting sky that's above it. It helps to push the viewer down into the foreground so that you're looking into what the main subject is. So it helps to frame things. Having clouds in the sky helps to push the eye down into the subject of the foreground, which is what we're shooting. We're shooting land, we're shooting landscape, right? So what's in the foreground is most important. And when you have that blue sky, or say we had a blue sky here, your eye is immediately drawn to that blue sky, where an angry sky helps to provide not only the mood, but helps to provide that framing to really focus the eye more down on the foreground. Weather is also instrumental in providing interesting light, like sunsets. If we didn't have clouds in the sky this day, I would not have had this color happening in the sky or in my foreground. So without those clouds, you're not going to find interesting light, not only at sunset, but also in the middle of the day. For example, on cloudy days when the light breaks through and just shines beams of light down onto the foreground, that dappled light is a treasure and what you're looking for. So you're looking for those interesting moments in light where you have dappled light, as they call it, where there's just a little bit of light here, a little bit of light there, a little bit of light there, highlighting things. So you need that weather to provide that interesting light. Without that weather, without clouds, then you're never going to have that interesting light. The light's always going to be harsh, or you're never going to get a sunset like this without clouds in the sky. Weather also helps to tell the story. And this is a perfect example of that. These are the redwoods in California. And what's instrumental to this environment is the way that the fog envelops the forest every night and every morning and provides that moisture to keep everything so lush. So I almost preferred capturing this scene in the foggy environment that I'm in here, as opposed to a clear day where the sun was coming through, because it does a couple of things. It provides that mood. It provides the story as to how this environment works and how everything interacts with each other in this environment. But it also helps to make the color pop too. Without the fog in the background, the greens of the foreground would get lost in the greens of the trees of the background. So it really helps the greens to pop off of the background here and to come into your face and to really highlight them when you have that gray background of the fog. So sometimes fog can be a good thing, where in other times it might be a bad thing. But the weather can help to tell and complete the story of the environment that you're shooting in. Much like the rustic cabin that we had a few pictures ago, that angry storm really told of how that house has stood the test of time through the years and the harsh environment that it lives in. So that mood and that environment of storm really helps to complete the story. So what do we do when we don't have these pristine conditions? Like, what do we do with poor weather conditions, like no clouds? When there's no clouds, I recommend that you focus on more intimate shots. Like the shot you see here was taken on a clear day in the afternoon in the golden hour, where normally you'd be setting up to get a big valley vista view and tons of aspens and mountains, but there were no clouds. So I said to myself, well, what's the point of shooting that? So I went around looking in the groves of the aspens for interesting shots like you see here. And I was able to get the backlit of meadow glowing behind these trees that really helped to make them pop off of the canvas, I guess you would say, but almost 3D effect as you can see here. And these little scenes are sometimes the most treasured because they're more unique than, say, the grand vista of shooting tunnel view at Yosemite. Oftentimes, some of my best shots have come from just shooting intimates on a clear day. Here's another intimate on a clear day in Death Valley, where I was on the sand dunes looking for that grand vista shot of snaking away sand dunes, running away from me into the mountains, but there were no clouds and the light was harsh. So I said, well, let's switch my thinking a little bit and shoot more intimate shots. And so I pulled a couple shots of textures of the sand in the late afternoon where the shadows are casting. And I really like this one because it's almost hypnotic in a way. You feel like it's almost shimmering when you look at it. One last intimate from Death Valley. Again, a lot of times when you go to Death Valley, you don't have a lot of clouds because it's a drier environment. And so you're forced to think out of the box. Here on this morning, I had the sunrise coming at my left shoulder and decided to, instead of shooting the sky and the mountains with a clear sky, I decided to get rid of the sky completely and just shoot the foreground and really focus on the textures and the light that was on the foreground there. This one was using a long lens where I poked in and just kind of selected a few of the zigzags and some of the features I liked to highlight. Another thing you can do when you are stuck in no cloud environments is to kind of change your thinking about grand shots. And this one is a little bit of a leap for some of you. And for some of you, this might be a little bit of a turnoff, but compositing is a way to get around that trip where you have a bad cloud experience. This particular shot was taken during a fall color trip last year. And I spent 12 days in Colorado and probably saw clouds on 2 of them. So what am I going to do? This particular shot, there were no clouds at sunset, and this is a little bit after the sunset here. And I thought to myself, while sitting there, well, I really can't do anything with this except if I add some clouds and maybe convert the light in some way. So a lot of this comes from post-processing, but when you change your perspective of what you can do with a particular shot, it can open up possibilities like this. So instead of just, honestly, that shot probably would have been a throwaway in most cases because of the clear sky for me. I just don't like clear skies. I went a little overboard with my edit here, but I created something to help kind of fulfill my satisfaction of visiting this location. And of course, when I visited it, I didn't get the vision that I wanted to, but I was able to create that vision later in post-processing by adding a sky and some interesting light to the scene to help create the vision that I had thought of and help make the photo feel a little bit warmer and more interesting. Here's another one from that trip where I visited this mill, a famous mill. It's called the Crystal Mill. And to get up there, you have to either hike 5 miles or have a friend that has 4-wheel drive vehicle that can go over boulders, basically. And I thought to myself when I visited, God, I don't have any clouds, but I don't know when I'm going to be able to get back here again, if ever. So my option was, well, maybe we just add some clouds into the sky. Now, this first edit I did, I'm probably going to go back and redo what I added to it. I don't quite like it 100%, but here it is. So I took the colors of the sunset and kind of blended them into this scene to create somewhat of the vision that I had thought of when visiting this spot. So changing your perspective a little bit when you're in those situations can help you to kind of fulfill the lack of weather that you're missing and kind of turn a trip that might have been sour into something that was worthwhile. Now, on the flip side of clear, we have overcast days. Now, most people think of an overcast day, they're like, I don't want to go shoot. Truth be told, these are some of the best days to shoot because the clouds act like a diffuser of light. When the sun comes through the clouds, it bounces around on all of the moisture particles and filters down that light in an even way onto the scene. meaning that you can almost shoot all day. So when it's wintertime in Yosemite, like the photo you see here, there's really not a time of the day that I stop shooting except to eat, because there's something to shoot throughout the day when it's overcast, because the light is always nice and even. Now, there is the downside. We can't really shoot those big grand scenes, really, such as Tunnel View. This is a portion of Tunnel View here, the Bridal Veil Fall. And the reason why I picked this smaller portion to photograph is because the sky was just super gray and it didn't look very good above the big valley shot. So I decided, let's get away from the grand view. And I chose to choose this sliver of the view with just Bridal Veil Falls sliding in between a little nook in the trees there. And so my first note here is to focus more on foreground textures and features. And that's what I did here. I focused more on the mountains, the snow textures of the rocks, as well as the snow on the trees, and let that be the focus or the subject of the scene and less the sky. There's still some sky there, and it's not the best sky, but it helps to frame the image and almost pushes the viewer down as well. So it's almost working as a top frame for me. In overcast conditions, you're going to have to wait for good moments of light, and that may not even come on some days. You might just have a dreary day where the sun doesn't break through. But in this situation, a few moments later from the shot that I just took, a little bit of light broke through and was shining on El Capitan. So I quickly turned and focused my camera and just cropped in and shot. This is almost at 200 millimeters, I think, and just shot the El Capitan with the light on it. One of my favorite photographs and moments. It reminds me a lot of like an Ansel Adams-esque moment. But the moments of good light are what you're waiting for on cloudy days. And you got to be patient. You might sit waiting for something to happen for a few hours. And that's sometimes tough to do, but it often pays off in dividends. When you're in a cloudy condition or overcast conditions, look for a little bit of color. In San Francisco, I had envisioned, beautiful sunrise or sunset with the Golden Gate Bridge and flowers, but it was not to be when I was visiting. We had high marine layer, and this is what you're stuck with in San Francisco a lot of the time. But I took advantage of the colors of these flowers, the greens and the purples, to kind of work with the red of the Golden Gate to create some pop. And that means that the eye is going to be less orientated and looking at, oh, it's a drowsy sky, and more focused on what's awesome about the photo, which is the green, the purple, and the red, which are the key subject of the photo anyway. So look for those color pops, whether it be some flowers or maybe some lichen on a rock or anything you can find to kind of add that little bit of pop on a cloudy day. On overcast days, I encourage you to just embrace the mood. There's not much you can do. You might not have much power to change it. And there's no way you're going to get that bright and happy shot that you probably envisioned when you were going to visit the location. A glorious sunrise with beautiful colors. Instead, you're stuck with this dreary, dark, cloudy type of environment. Well, embrace that and take photos that have a little bit darker meaning to them. This photo here isn't the best example. Here, I kind of flipped it on itself and said, well, let's try and create something bright even in these dark and dreary conditions. What really helps is that we have these pink rhododendrons blooming in this scene, which help to provide that warm color pop and kind of brighten the image. Without the blooming pinks, I probably would have gone for a much darker edit, something a little bit more cinematic and depressed feeling. With the edit, but here I was able to create something bright. But embrace the mood that you're presented with. If it's a dark and dreary feel, look for compositions and shots that kind of embrace that feeling. So the next thing I'd like to talk about with weather is harsh weather, which is sometimes the most difficult to shoot in, but it can also produce some of the best shots. This image on the right, if I was to tell you that, well, if you thought about the conditions that it was taken in, you'd probably say, well, it was probably okay. It looks like a beautiful day. We've got a rainbow, some clouds. Reality is it was some of the worst shooting conditions that I've ever experienced. And let me show you a video so that you can see what I mean. So super windy. My goodness, it must have been blowing 30 mile-an-hour gusts. When I first woke up this morning, my car was literally shaking in the wind. We couldn't pitch tents because they would blow away. And then when we got out to shoot, everything was fine. There was no rain yet, but it was very windy. Had to lower my tripod really low to keep the center of gravity low so the camera wouldn't vibrate. And this is in low light, mind you. So we were trying to get, some longer shutters, and with the blowing of the bushes, it was really tough. So what I did is I put on a circular polarizer, and then I put on my NiSi holder and put on a grad just so that I could have something to wipe off the rain when it started to rain. And it was blowing so hard, the rain, once this rainbow showed up and I got excited, that by the time you turned your camera around to shoot, it was already wet. So it was a matter of basically turning the camera around, wiping off the graduated filter from all the water, flipping it back around, taking a shot, turning it around, wiping it again, turning it around. And it was just constantly doing that, trying to get this shot off. It was really nerve-wracking because I knew this moment was kind of special. We had the fall colors, and this year it was awesome. As you can see, the colors were just on fire. And then we had this rainbow happening, and rainbows, I mean, I've only caught, this is like the first one I've caught, I think. They're just not, they don't happen in great compositions very often. So very stressful situation, but some quick thinking, basically in terms of how my equipment was set up to help me to get the shot off by putting on that grad filter, even though I probably didn't need it, and just wiping that down and flipping it around, much like a waterfall type of shot. Now, I also did some things with my camera. I basically lowered my f-stop a little bit to f8, where I normally shoot at like f11. And I also raised my ISO so I could get a shutter speed off that would allow me to freeze the bushes that were constantly blowing. And of course, the trees on the slope there were blowing too. So all those things kind of came together to get the shot. But as you can see with the blowing wind in that video, it was chaotic. It wasn't an easy shot to get off for sure. One of the most stressful situations that I've been in, but also one of the most rewarding. Another one, this one was taken during a thunderstorm type afternoon in Death Valley. And again, with the wind, as you can see in the video, actually blowing sand. I was keeping myself low there because actually as you stood up, some of the sand was blowing up at about head height. And so this is an environment that's crazy to shoot in. You've got blowing sand when your camera is totally exposed, you're exposed, and one of the most feared situations to have a camera really. So again, to protect my camera in this situation, or at least the lens, I put on my circular polarizer, which served a double purpose. One, I used it to kind of drown out some of the highlights in the sand because sand can be somewhat reflective. And it also helped me to darken the sky and get a little bit more contrast out of the sky. But it also served the purpose of protecting my lens as well, much like a UV filter would that a lot of you have. I used the circular polarizer in the same capacity here to help protect the lens from any blowing sand. Now my camera got pelted, and ultimately after this trip, I took the camera in to get serviced to make sure that it was completely clean, because blowing sand is no fun. But as you can see from this environment, it can really lend to some of the best conditions. Blowing sand may be treacherous to shoot in, but it also provides some of the best conditions on sand dunes. You have no footprints on the sand dunes, as you can see, and the textures are ultra awesome during heavy windstorms. So again, sometimes the best shots can come from the most chaotic of weather conditions. So you got to be prepared for that and know what you're getting into and kind of have tools to help you get through it. Oops, sorry about that. So moving on from weather, I'd like to talk about some of the equipment issues you're going to run into when shooting landscape. First and foremost, the most common that you're going to see is a dirty lens. And dirty lenses are not uncommon. Here are some of the tools that I use when cleaning a dirty lens. First and foremost, I use a rocket blower, and I'm going to go in order of use and kind of talk about why. First, I use a rocket blower to clean my lens because if there's any large particles of dust or dirt that are on the lens, you don't want to wipe that with, say, a microfiber cloth yet. You want to try and blow those particles off because it may scratch your lens or your filter. So rocket blow is the first thing that I will do to my lens when I'm cleaning it. The second would be a soft bristle brush. And that just kind of helps to sweep off any particles that were stuck that the rocket blower could not get off. Then once I've done those two things and I'm sure that I don't have any large particles of sand or dirt on the lens, I take the microfiber cloth and I wipe any small particles of dust and any residue that might be on the lens. Lastly, I also might use a felt tip cleaning pen. A felt tip cleaning pen is much like a microfiber cloth, but it's a little bit finer in texture, so it can really help to get residue like salt water or some sort of hard water off of your lens. Below, you'll see some samples of all of these things, including the rocket blower, the soft bristled brush, and felt tip on the left. And there's some interesting, they have these larger swabs that you can use to clean filters up there on the middle top. And then, of course, a microfiber cloth should be in everybody's bag, and it's usually in my pocket, to be honest, because I clean my lens often, especially when shooting it by the ocean. And then, of course, another felt tip pen. So these things are really crucial in cleaning your lens. Now, the picture you see on the right is an example of a situation that I had never run into, and this was about a year ago up in the Oregon coast. You can't tell by this exposure because I gave us the brightest exposure here of this shot, but it was a magnificent sunset. And I'm getting the sun star coming through the trees here, but you can see this weird orb around the sun. And so I'm looking at the preview of the shot, waiting for glory, and I see this orb and I go, oh no, there is something wrong. I've got something on my lens, and that's for sure. So the first thing I did was clean the front of the lens and did that a thorough job, put the lens, set up the camera again, and took a shot, and I'm still getting the orb. And so the next thing that I would check, and that I checked, would be the rear element, so the back of the lens. So I cleaned that too, put the lens back on, checked again, and we still have this orb. Wow. Frustration, because this is like a 1 in 20 chance of getting a glorious sunset, and I can't seem to get a picture off. So I'm sweating. My friend is giving me a hard time who I'm shooting with. He's like, oh, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss it. And so the next step I could think of was simply that there must be some residue inside the lens, because I've cleaned both of them. They look spotted clean. And so that was the diagnosis. I had some moisture inside the lens. Inside your lens, there's not just two lenses, there's many pieces of glass. And the previous morning, or this morning that we were shooting this, I was shooting in rain, and I didn't dry off my lens and my camera well enough in between sunrise and sunset shoots. And that moisture ended up developing and condensing inside of my lens. And I'd never had this happen before because I live in Southern California, and most of the environments that I shoot in are fairly dry, either high altitude, desert, or here in Southern California, we just don't have a lot of moisture. But up in the redwoods in the morning, I mean, it's like 100% humidity and everything's wet. And so I hadn't experienced that before. So I learned a valuable lesson on this trip, and that is simply to just make sure that you dry out your gear really fully. The next day, I was able to fix this issue and didn't have this orb anymore. I had to dry out the camera by sitting it in front of a dryer all night, a couple hours that night. And then I also let it sit in the sun the next morning so that UV rays would kill any of the mildew or bacteria that might be growing inside of the lens. I still took the lens in to get serviced so that I could make sure it was 100% clean, because obviously if any elements inside your lens are dirty, then you're just going to be experiencing issues. So, but it was a valuable learning lesson. And definitely a surprising one. So cleaning your lens, very important. Not only because, first and foremost, it's the iris of your camera. So when you have any spots in your lens shooting towards the sun, you're going to see artifacts such as, glowy little orbs or hexagons sometimes in certain lenses. Now, we talked a little bit last slide about my camera getting wet, and that's why I wanted to do a slide on wet equipment, because what equipment is going to be happening when you go to chase, say, good weather conditions like snowy conditions in Yosemite, or are you shooting in the rain during a rainstorm for a rainbow? So how do we protect our equipment? Well, first and foremost, I recommend buying a weather sealed camera. If you're going to be a landscape photographer, it's kind of a critical thing. Weather sealed isn't waterproof, but it helps to prevent things from getting inside the camera, such as dust or water. It's an extra barrier of protection. Now, your camera obviously can't sit out in a rainstorm if it's weather sealed, but if you get a couple drops on it, you're not going to be sweating. I make sure to buy weather sealed bodies as well as lenses to make sure that I can shoot in the conditions that I want to be able to shoot in. Now, getting wet is really bad for electronics. I mean, that's kind of I guess it goes without saying. But we really want to avoid getting wet as much as possible because moisture can leak inside and cause corrosion, especially salt water. And for me, that's the thing that I deal with most here in Southern California because I'm shooting seascapes a lot and it doesn't rain a lot here. So I want to make sure that I don't get salt water on it because salt water, as you may or may not know, is highly corrosive. It's just going to eat away at everything, your screws on your body, and then it starts seeping in and going into the connections. So some tips for if you do get wet. Maybe you get splashed shooting by the ocean, as I often have because I like to put myself in the danger zone, or maybe you're getting wet by shooting that rainbow moment. Ultimately, if you do get super soaked, you're going to want to put your camera or your lens inside of a bag of rice as soon as possible. Reason why is because the rice will help to suck the moisture out of the body and out of the lens. So when you get home, you're going to want to just drop it into that and seal it and leave it in there for 24 to 72 hours, depending on how bad the soaking was. And then test the equipment after a period of time to see if it's functional again. And it may still need servicing. Right at the scene of the accident, things you can do to help prevent further damage. One is turn off your camera immediately. So if you get soaked with water, just turn the camera off and then grab your rocket blower and start blowing off water from everything. And it may take a few minutes, but you're going to want to rocket blow the best you can out of every crevice in your body, where the hot shoe is, all of the buttons, the top buttons, where any dials might be, and just really rocket blow all the water out of there immediately. And this happens a lot with me at the ocean. I get doused every once in a while and just have to sit there and blow it all out. If you really got doused and say you got soaked, your camera got soaked, your bag got soaked, it was a really wet moment, maybe even you dropped your camera in some water for a brief moment. Well, my recommendation is to very carefully while you're driving home, maybe somebody else is driving and you can hold your camera out the window, but that airflow will help to pull the moisture out and give a little bit extra drying out as you're driving home. It's a little bit dangerous, of course, holding your camera outside of the window, but if you can do it, I recommend it because it could mean the difference between a done camera and maybe one that survives. I always carry silica packs in my bag, and not just for just casual keeping things dry, and it does a good job at that. So for example, when I go to shoot the redwoods now, I always have silica packs everywhere to help pull moisture out of my camera bag. But they also work, say, if you get soaked, they can kind of help to pull that moisture out as you're going home and keep that moisture start that moisture to evaporate basically on your way home. So silica packs, save them when you go to buy a new bag or a new pair of shoes. Don't just toss them away, put them in your camera bag and just keep them in there for at least a year. They last longer than you think. Ultimately, you want to send that camera or that lens off to be serviced to make sure that you didn't have any corrosion happening. Whoever your camera company is, send it back to them. They'll open it up and make sure that everything is safe and sound. And if there's any corrosion happening, then you'll get it fixed. One of the most common things that you'll see when you have corrosion, and it's a sheer sign of it, is after a good soaking, if your camera buttons aren't working quite right, then it's time to take your camera in immediately. Some other equipment issues that I have in both care and just basically use of tripods. Tripods are sometimes the most misunderstood, I should say, things of photography, at least in some of the students that I have had. Things that I've seen my students doing are using like their center column to raise the height of the camera instead of using the legs of the tripod. This is kind of a bad thing to do with a tripod because when you raise the center column of your tripod, you're basically creating a flagpole for your camera, and it's going to be very wobbly. So in windy conditions, it's going to waver a little bit. Or for example, if you're shooting long exposure or short shutters or lazy shutters, I should say, like the picture you see here, the camera might vibrate a little bit, causing some less sharp of an image, right? So I recommend that you don't use your center column unless it's absolutely necessary. And I would consider it not being a windy day before using it. Oftentimes the center column is more of a videographer's type of thing, or an indoor type of thing, like shooting real estate, for example. So avoid using that center column. Use your tripod legs to raise the height of the camera. That's what they're there for. Another thing I see people mistake a lot is not balancing their tripod legs. They'll have, one tripod leg is too long and it's actually the tripod's pointing backwards, and then they use the ball head to point the camera down, and the camera and the tripod start to look like a bird like this, where the camera's pointing downwards, but the tripod's pointing backwards, and it's just not balanced. And it scares me because any sort of tipping or knocking of that tripod and the camera is going to go backwards because it's not centered. So make sure you balance your legs. Just always take a moment to either lengthen or shorten a couple legs in the position that you want them so that your ball head is resting even. And then your tripod's going to work much more better for you. It's going to balance the camera better. It's going to hold it stronger in the wind, and you don't have to worry about it falling over as much because the camera's being balanced. One big issue I see is composing your shots with a tripod is really trouble for most people because they're limited with their tripod. To change the camera's position, you really have to adjust a lot of things on the tripod to get it to move up and down, or you have to move it left or right. So what I recommend to really help you is to take your camera off the tripod, go walk around without your tripod and compose shots, moving up and down with your body, and find that position that you want your camera to be in, and then set up the tripod. And I think you'll find a much easier time composing the shot once you've done that. At first, it's very difficult to work with the tripod because you're just not experienced in using it and how it functions. So walking around without your camera will help you in those beginning stages to help compose those shots with that tripod. Not enough people utilize spikes on their tripod when shooting non-urban environments or out in nature. The rubber feet that you get on your tripod work great in most cases for like concrete or firm environments, hard dirt. But if you get in soft sand or in snow or on ice, and even some rocky situations, spikes on the bottom of your tripod work much better in stabilizing the camera and ultimately perform better. So if you have the ability to buy spikes for your tripod, and you can look into it, look up your company and see if they offer spikes. Most do. And you can buy them separately and screw off the rubber feet and screw in spikes. And when you're out in nature, you can use those. Really recommend spikes. They can come in handy, especially on icy environments, because rubber feet just slide all over. So some things that I see in my students and even in my tripods is equipment failures. And they're going to happen with every tripod, but there's some things that we can talk about to help improve the length of use of your tripod. I'm sure a lot of you have had a tripod where you have a frozen leg that won't extend anymore, no matter what you do. It's basically rusted or corroded into position, and you can't extend that piece of the leg anymore. Or you might have a fastener that won't open or close anymore because it's got so much dirt or grime into it, right? The opposite side is I also have had some with weak fasteners where the fastener doesn't hold the leg anymore. And as you set up the tripod, it starts to dip and tilt, and you're always trying to tighten that fastener and it won't tighten enough. These problems are mostly caused by lack of cleaning. And it's something that I've learned throughout my photography career is that you just need to take care of your tripod. And it's something that a lot of people don't do enough of or tell you that you should be doing. It's kind of like a bicycle, right? You can ride a bike for years, but unless you take care of that chain and those gears and clean them, then they're going to get dirty and they're going to stop performing as well. Same thing is true with your tripod. So you got to clean that tripod. And when you do, take everything apart during your cleaning. Take out every screw, undo every fastener, really take it apart. And you might need to take a photo as you go, or maybe take a video as you go to remind yourself how to put it back together with some tripods, but most are fairly simple. And you'd be surprised when you take it apart, there's not too many parts to put back together, but it's very important that you do that so you can get all the corrosion out of every little piece. And when you do take it apart, before you put it back together, lubricate the joints, the screws, the fasteners, put some WD-40 on it or some other lubricant that will help protect it. And that will help to ensure that it doesn't get corroded as fast if you're shooting environments like I do, like in the ocean. But it'll ensure that those parts continue to work and work smoother for longer. So what are some common things that I see from my students that they struggle with? Well, first and foremost is composing shots. I think this is one of the most difficult things in photography, is finding that creative vision. A lot of the times I'm teaching my students to find smaller subjects that are a portion of the big picture. A lot of landscape photography is not about the big picture, but focusing in on a piece of the big picture. For example, the mud cracks that you see here. These are about 100 yards wide, and I could have shot a shot that shows all of these cracks going everywhere, but it would have just been overpowering and really a mess. So instead, I got my camera really, really low, almost a few inches off the ground, and highlighted just a couple of the cracks going away from me to really draw the viewer into that subject and to highlight it more. So this can hold true in other environments too. Like if you have a big sunflower field, well, don't just shoot all of the sunflowers, get close to a couple of them and shoot them up close to really highlight that. And really choose a piece of the subject as your subject. Utilizing scale is really important. Scale helps the viewer to relate to things. For example, this is a piece of the hillside that earlier rainbow shot was taken at. And this was at a different day, I think, with different weather conditions. But we had this giant hillside, and I really liked the abstract feel of all the different colors. It almost looked like a oil painting where somebody had taken a tissue of different colors and just dabbed it. But I added the tree to help provide some scale so you could see how big this field was, because I was compressing in so much. The tree helped to provide that scale. That's probably a 50 to a 75-foot tree there. And so you can imagine how many aspens were surrounding it. So utilizing scale is really important when you're creating compositions. You can also trick the viewer into different types of scales and fooling the viewer to think something is bigger or smaller in a composition by the way that you compose it too. Experimenting with different focal lengths is huge in creating compositions. If you're just shooting with one lens, say a 16 to 35, you're really missing a lot of things. For example, here at Zabriskie Point, a lot of the people go to shoot this shot and they shoot with that wide angle lens and they get the grand view with the Zabriskie Point and the mountains in the background. But really, there's some interesting things to find with your zoom lens as well. This shot here in particular was probably taken at about 120 millimeters and really pushed in and just highlighted some of the textures and the light hitting them. Instead of doing that big grand vista, you can really poke in and grab something new. So changing focal lengths can really help to alter your perspective of places and things so that you're getting a better result in the long run. One thing I see my students fail with the most is framing the composition with objects in this shot. So there's always a piece of the frame that isn't quite framed in. Maybe it's the top of the frame or the bottom of the frame. One thing that's critical and use is just like foreground elements. For example, here, I use the trees and that V shape to really highlight and focus the viewer on the waterfall. So using those key objects to kind of frame the bottom of the shot really helps to frame the key subject, for example. So when I'm shooting seascapes, I'm always looking for water motion to help frame the scene, because that bottom part of the frame helps to complete the picture. And so always look for foreground interest in your compositions and make sure that you're using objects to help frame your key subjects. One thing that I see most people scared to do is get close to their subject. And with their wide angle lens, they're shooting like 12 feet away from something, where really, for example, these poppies, I was just a few feet, maybe 2 to 3 feet away from them to make sure that they looked big and to really isolate just a few of them. You need to get close with your wide angle lens because your field of view is so wide. It's like looking through the peephole in a hotel. You can almost see down the hallways both ways. Well, wide angle lenses aren't quite that extreme, but it's the same concept. So everything looks further away. It's like your side view mirror kind of makes things look further away, or actually it makes it look closer. Bad example, but you get the idea. Things look further away because of that wide angle. So that means you need to get closer to things. Oftentimes when I'm shooting foreground interest with my wide angle lens, I'm just a few inches away, a few feet away. I get really close to things because you need to, because of that wide field of view. So don't be scared. I think that there's really a hard way to get too close to things. So when you think about it, just go closer. Tell yourself in your mind, get closer, get closer. I'm always telling myself that. Another mistake I often see out in the field is that people forget that your camera can turn in 2 different orientations and take a picture. A lot of my students show up to my workshops and they just want to shoot the wide angle landscape, because landscape photography, landscape orientation, for some, they put those 2 and 2 together as they are necessary to be together, but they're not. Here, this scene, early in the golden hour, I shot it in vertical format. And in this composition, it worked well because the tower is vertical. So a vertical format worked really well. I also sometimes shoot in that vertical format if I want a field of view that's more up and down. Obviously, I've got more field of view up and down in portrait than I do in landscape, right? So that allowed me to shoot the clouds up high as well as the water happening below. But then later at sunset, I had these nice lines, these horizontal lines that came through the horizontal orientation really well. So I turned the camera over and shot it in that orientation too. And oftentimes when I'm shooting a scene, I immediately just do that as a habit, because you never know which one you're going to like when you get home. So choose those different orientations. Go back and forth, and maybe you'll end up liking one or the other immediately and say, oh, this is a portrait shot, or, oh, wait, this looks better this way. But you got to rotate your camera and think of those 2 different orientations while you're shooting. My pet peeve out there in the field is when my students don't level their camera. One, it just looks wonky when your horizon is not straight. So I do it in camera right away. It's hard to correct sometimes when you get home too, especially if you don't have a flat horizon like the ocean. But if you do, you can sometimes correct it, and maybe sometimes it doesn't look quite right. So in the field, use that leveler on the back of your camera. Most of you have it. In live view, you can push info on most cameras and it'll cycle through and give you the leveler, and just level that camera so that you know that the camera's level and you're shooting in a proper orientation. Saves you a lot of headache when you go home trying to make sure everything's vertical. Some other common issues are mostly camera settings. I think I get that question more often than not in the field. Hey, what are your settings? And that is the big question mark for most people, but it's really the most simplest thing about photography. The hard part is getting and composing a great shot. The settings should be the easy part. So learn the exposure triangle and how each works. If you don't shoot in manual mode, I encourage you to do it. There's only 3 components. One is aperture, and that is going to control your depth of field, right? And that's all you should think about with it. I see a lot of students changing their aperture to change their exposure, and that's the wrong way of thinking. Your aperture is something that you set, and you kind of keep that way. And you only adjust it when it's absolutely necessary, because you want to make sure you have that strong depth of field. Shutter speed is simply the length of exposure, but I use it more as my exposure adjustment. It's much like shooting in manual is much like shooting in aperture mode, where most of the time you're going to be adjusting the shutter speed to adjust your exposure. There are some cases where you need to control that shutter speed when things are in motion, but in general, my shutter speed basically adjusts my exposure. So I set my aperture and I simply dial in the exposure with my shutter speed. But shutter speed just controls the length of time you're exposing for. And then ISO. And you guys all know this, but ISO is sensor sensitivity. So how sensitive the sensor is to light. It's almost like how much sunscreen the sensor is wearing. As it's at ISO 100, it's wearing some SPF 125. But as it gets down to ISO 800, it doesn't have much sunscreen on at all, and that light can come through very fast. So these 3 things are all you have to remember, and it's not very hard, but once you understand what each does and you really break it down and shoot in manual mode, they become much more simpler and kind of a secondary thought during the shooting process. Most of the time, you're more thinking about composition and how well the image is exposed and less about how are the settings lining up. So if you aren't shooting in manual, get out of those program modes like aperture mode and shutter speed mode. They're a great crutch, but they're actually hurting you in the long run. Hurting you because you can't control your exposure as well when you're shooting in program modes. You're going to have to use exposure compensation to darken or lighten the photo in most cases, where if you're in a manual mode, you can simply just make those quick adjustments with your aperture or, your shutter speed and possibly your aperture in some situations if you need to. But program modes are great if you're, say, in aperture mode. I guess it would be okay in some situations, but you're going to tend to walk away with some photos that were exposed well and some photos that weren't exposed well. Where in manual, you can make sure that every photo is exposed to the proper way, and you're paying much more attention to that exposure. Most people don't do this, but I encourage you to do it. And if you haven't already, do it right away. Read your camera's manual and learn how everything works. Can you imagine only using your phone to make phone calls and that's it? If that's all we knew how to do, our phone would be it would be the worst. It would be scary to use. Let's put it that way. So you need to learn how to use your camera and how everything works so that you can completely understand what's going on with it. And you might learn some things that are going to be handy in some specific situation down the line. But once you understand how those camera functions work, you'll be more familiar with it, and you can pull those things out of your arsenal when necessary in those specific situations. Understanding how the programs work, you can make custom functions, how to change button functions, how to change your camera profile, how to change your focus points, all of that stuff you need to understand because there's going to be situations where you need to adjust those. And most of my students haven't done that yet. So get your camera manual out, take a chapter each day and go through it and really focus in on what it's doing. It's hard to do, I know, because it's just a bunch of gobbledygook, but ultimately there's great information in there that's going to help you pay dividends down the line. Let's put it that way. Now, one of the last things I want to talk about with things that common errors for my students is the exposure. And exposure is really tricky. It's the key subject of photography. Photography is all about exposure. All those settings that you talk about with aperture and shutter speed and ISO, they all gear towards exposure. So getting a good exposure is really key. Most people that I run into overexpose their images a little bit. Some of them, a rare case, underexpose a great deal because they probably had a previous teacher who told them to, and they're overcompensating now. But most overexpose. And it's really critical that you don't overexpose your images, specifically in situations like you see here on the screen with this image at a sunset. If you overexpose this image, you're going to lose all of that beautiful color in the sky and the highlight detail. And it's just going to look like a big blob of atomic weapon going off in the horizon. And you're going to not have anything to edit when you go home. So this is a raw file of that shot. And you can see that if you look at the image, the sky looks a little bright. And that's true because I do have a little bit of highlight clipping. I struggled to get this all in one shot. But if you notice, the shadows are really dark. And first thing people look at when they're exposing their image and they're previewing their shot is the shadows. And you can't be scared of having a little bit of shadows. But if we look at the histogram here, I don't have any black clipping or my image isn't too dark. There's detail there to be recovered. And as you can see from the image on the right, there's plenty of color and detail that was recovered from that darker exposure. So making sure that you're exposing and getting a good exposure is instrumental in improving your photography. It's going to help you to get the detail that you want and the colors that you want, especially during golden hours like this one. So when I'm looking at exposing my image, I'm using that histogram that we just saw on the previous screen to dial my exposure in and to tell how I need to expose this image. Most of the time, I'm looking to expose my image as bright as possible without getting any highlight clipping. But in some cases, like this scene, I had to take a bracketed shot. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But using my histogram helped to dictate what I needed to do there to get the best exposure that I needed, to make sure that my highlights were exposed, and I was also getting detail in the shadow. So I watched the histogram while composing the shot, but also after I take the shot, I look at the histogram of the preview to make sure that I'm getting the exposure that I need to go home with to get the best detail and to have what I need for post-processing. So let your histogram be that guide for good exposure, not what you see on the screen or what you think is right. But the histogram is a digital readout and it tells no lies as to whether that is a good exposure or not. So trust your histogram. Students often mishandle contrasted light. And this scene here was one where I had to handle a lot of contrast. We had a really dark scene down in the forest with really bright highlights up in the tops of the trees. And so what I did is I used bracketing to help to expose all of those areas using multiple shots. And if you're not using exposure bracketing, I encourage you to start experimenting with it. Taking a dark, a medium, and and a bright photo will help you to compile all the tonal range or all of the shadows and the highlights that you need in post-processing. So using exposure bracketing really helps you to handle contrasted light. Now, in some situations, a contrast is seen like a seascape. You're not able to take bracketed shots because of the water motion, or maybe you're taking a long exposure and you can't bracket a 2-minute exposure because you're gonna have to take a 1 minute and a 4 minute as well. So that's not gonna work. You gotta use a graduated filter. So graduated filters help to darken the top of the image or the highlighted areas of the image so that the histogram becomes less contrasted and you're able to expose everything in one shot. Both ways are ways to handle a contrasted lighting situation, such as a sunset or when we have shadows and bright lights, and both work really well. It just depends on the situation you're in as to what you use. We just talked about graduated filters, and filters are often the most misused things, specifically the circular polarizer. This is one area where I see my students struggle, and they just don't know what it does, when to use it, and how it works. Ultimately, what a polarizer does is it reduces glare from reflective surfaces. These surfaces could be foliage, water, or glass. They don't really work well on metallic surfaces. So like a car, for example, might work okay with the paint, but something like a sheet of aluminum, for example, you're not going to remove the reflection from that using a polarizer. Here in this scene, the top is without polarizer and the bottom image is with polarizer. There are no adjustments to anything else. Nothing has been edited. No camera settings have been changed. Simply the polarizer. And you can see the difference. The ferns are much richer in green. The highlighted areas of the ferns where the light is reflecting off, that's gone. And then if you look at the water, you cannot see the rocks through the water in the top image because that reflected light is bouncing off of the water. But then when we remove that reflected light, you can see through the water and down into the rocks and the colors that are there. So a polarizer is like the most critical tool in a landscape photographer's bag in terms of filters, in my opinion. Some things to learn though, to make sure that they work for you. Well, one more image actually before we move on. Here you can see where the reflected light in the water below the waterfall was removed using the polarizer, thus taking away the distraction of that water texture and focusing the eye more on the subject, which was the waterfall. So it's often used in these types of scenes where you have reflected water like a lake or a waterfall. Not a lot used and when I do seascaping at sunset, but in the middle of the day, I use it often at the ocean to help cut down that reflected light. Okay, some things to know about it. One, the CPL has to be rotated to change the intensity. It in fact can be changed. It doesn't just screw onto the front of your lens. You do that and then you rotate it to change the intensity of the effect. You can turn it all the way off or turn it up to 100% where it's very strong. Some scenes, you might turn it up all the way. Some scenes, it might be 25 or 50%. And it really depends on the scene and how much of that CPL effect that you want. An important other thing to remember is that it really only works 90 degrees from the sun. So, and it doesn't work very far from either direction. So if it was 90 degrees, you might only have 20 degrees on either side of that 90 degrees where it works effectively. That causes some problems when we use a wide angle lens because our field of view is so wide. When we're 90 degrees, we can also see almost 45 degrees in either direction. What it causes is a vignetting effect where the CPL works in a part of the sky or a part of the image, but it doesn't work in the other part. So when you're using a wide angle, be careful on how much you turn up that vignetting or that CPL effect because you're going to see that vignetting start to occur. I typically don't use my CPL unless I'm somewhere around 24 millimeters or more. And generally it works really well on say a zoom lens or a medium focal lens like your 24 to 70 or your 70 to 200. One thing I recommend is that you avoid blue skies with a wide angle lens with the polarizer because it's going to cause a weird effect unless you're directly 90 degrees and shooting 90 degrees. So if you're for some reason off from 90 degrees from the sun, you're going to see that vignetting happening on a clear day. When it's a cloudy day, you have a little bit more to play with and it can kind of hide some of that darkening effect, but on a clear day, it's almost clear as day where that vignetting is happening. So be very careful with blue skies, really clear blue skies and what direction you're shooting. Okay, ultimately, the thing that I see my students need to do most is basically just practice. And they need to get out more with their camera. If you're going to try and pick up your camera once a month and go on that photography adventure and expect to come home with spectacular imagery, you're not going to achieve it that way. You got to get out and practice. Just like anything else in life, you got to put in the repetition, right? Photography is a lot like a muscle memory. It's almost like, I think of it because I played a lot of sports. I think of it like any other sport I used to play. If you're going to be good at golf, well, you got to hit the range 2 times a week and hit the putting green if you want to score well on Sunday. So the same is true for photography. You got to go out and experience different things. You got to practice what you've learned. And by practicing and experiencing different situations of lighting and foreground and areas, you're going to be shooting in different situations that are going to challenge you and make you come up with different things to solve the problems to get a good image. So getting out there to practice is essential to growing your photography as a skill set. Get out there and shoot. If it means just taking a 30-minute walk around your neighborhood to maybe just exercise some of the skills and expose some images, great, do that. If it means I'm going to dedicate 2 times a week to going out and finding a place to shoot for sunset, that's great. But you got to get out there and shoot. Practice makes perfect. The other side of things is not just in the field, but you got to spend more time learning editing skills, because editing is where you really complete the photograph. Great photos are taken in the field. Don't get me wrong. I've taken some images that look great straight off the back of the camera. But ultimately, if you really want to get great images and to complete the final vision that you have, you got to learn new editing skills. And when you learn new editing skills, you're going to get those abilities to complete that final vision and really make the images that you want. But it's also going to lead you to new infield techniques. You might learn an editing technique that requires a specific in-field shot process. Maybe that's exposure bracketing, or maybe it's focus bracketing, or taking different images at different focal lengths to blend together. All sorts of things that you can learn through editing that you will grow into a technique in the field. One more touch, and the last thing I'm going to leave you with is that you need to go out and explore more. I think oftentimes people get stuck going to places that are familiar. They go to Yosemite, they go to Tunnel View, they shoot Yosemite Falls, but they didn't take that mile hike up the road, from the road, to go venture up there and see what's up there. You got to get out and explore. And that means getting out and taking some areas that you might not have thought about exploring, and you might just discover something that you're going to unexpected. And that's really what the key is finding things that are unexpected, not only to you, but they're going to be unexpected to your viewer or the person viewing your photos. Really explore the full extent of an area. As I've gone through, revisiting locations, I think the 3rd or 4th visit I go to someplace, I really end up going and exploring an area, and I find things that I wish I had found earlier. And so really explore to the full extent. Take those downtimes in the middle of the day when maybe the lighting's not so great or the weather's bad, to take that exploration hike and look at these areas that you should be checking out. Make sure you work a scene completely. And what do I mean by that? Well, this particular scene at Convict Lake, oftentimes you'll see photographers just show up and plop their camera up on top of a bridge that sits on top of the edge of the lake there and just shoot from there. Where if you walked along the shoreline, like here, you can find some great foreground interest that can really complete or help to frame the photograph better. You got to work the scene and maybe move your camera around, try different things, and take lots of different compositions when I say work the scene, and just experiment, and you'll find compositions that maybe you didn't expect, or you'll come home with a lot of compositions that you can choose from and choose the best ultimately. But if you work the scene, you got to work it, move that camera back and forth, up and down, and change your perspective so that you can find more compositions and more interesting points of view. Patience is something that a lot of landscape photographers struggle in, but you got to be patient and wait for the right moments. This photograph was basically an afternoon of sitting there waiting for the right clouds to pass overhead that would block the light so that I could expose the image in one shot and do the long exposure. And it was a real struggle because I waited for about an hour, gave up, went back to the car, and all of a sudden some clouds came back over, and I hopped back out of the car and went down to put my camera up on the shoreline, waited another 20 minutes, and then I finally got the shot off. But it was worth the wait. Patience. It's all about patience. Waiting for a storm to clear in Yosemite is like watching molasses. It can take a day and a half, but that patience pays off when you get that glorious moment when the storm clears. So you got to be patient, wait for the right moments, and spend some more time waiting for the shot to happen instead of expecting it to happen. All right, guys, that's it for me. I hope that you enjoyed today's webinar and pulled some things away that are going to help you in difficult weather situations. Some of the things that have happened to me in the field, like my lens getting dirty and how I clean that and get it back to working order. Hopefully you pulled some things away that you're going to use in the near future. And hopefully you enjoyed some of the information that I provided today. I want to thank first and foremost, before I give it back to Jim for any questions that we might have, thank you, NiSi, once again for having me on. Really appreciate you guys, and I've got nothing but love for you guys over there.
We do for you as well, Chris. You're great, and as usual, really, really great presentation. And I do have some questions that I've been promising people I would ask. I didn't think any question required putting the brakes on things. So we're going to go back and figure this out here. All right, first of all, do you always use a polarizer to make your clouds pop? If not, when do you decide to shoot with a polarizer and when not to use one?
That's a really good question. There's two factors. One is what focal length am I going to shoot the shot at? So if I'm shooting at a wider focal length, such as 16 millimeters, I usually forego the polarizer because it's going to cause that vignetting in the scene. But if I'm shooting at something like 35, then yeah, most of the time, and it's usually more of a directional thing. So if my composition is a 90-degree light shot, then I'm going to use the polarizer more often than not. Really, I think what I think of most is what's going on in my scene. I think back to a trip to the Redwoods recently where we were shooting some wildflowers in the late afternoon, and just the petals of the wildflowers were reflecting a little bit of light. I didn't have any clouds and I wasn't shooting 90 degrees, but that polarizer helped remove that reflective light a little bit. So that was kind of a decision too. I don't think it really depends on there's no really like set thing that says like every cloudy day I'm going to use a polarizer and vice versa. I'm not going to use a polarizer. I think a lot of factors coming in, and it's a lot about just putting it on and experimenting with it and seeing if I like what the effect is doing. Some cases I like what the effect is doing and oh, that's great. And other ones I go, nope, I'll just leave that off today. I don't quite like what it's doing. So okay. I think at first that's a great tip for you is to just try it out, see how the effect works. And if it's improving the photograph, great. If it's not improving the photograph, well, then go ahead and leave it off.
Okay. Equipment question. And I think you're a Nikon shooter, are you not?
I am a Canon shooter, but pretty familiar with all bodies.
Okay. Just that someone wanted to know if you used Olympus because Olympus touts its water resistance. But I believe both Nikon and Canon have a degree of water resistance as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think most larger or more expensive bodies in any line are going to be more weather resistant. Top of the line Sony's like the A7R4, the Canon 5D Mark IV, Canon R5, the Nikon D850, they all are weather sealed. I don't know. I don't get a lot of Olympus customers, mostly because of the micro four thirds, and it's not a great camera for low light, which a lot of my customers are. So I don't get a lot of Olympus shooters, but I don't know if they have anything more special than any other company, like a waterproof camera. I think they're just strong weather resistant, like any other.
Yeah, and they really touted
major body would be
in their press.
Oh,
all right, so the next thing is one of your viewers had noticed that you have very, very strong foreground. So when shooting foreground, I guess Chris is using hyperfocal distance. I struggle with this. Can you ask Chris how to do this correctly?
It's a really good question. Hyperfocal distance is a real key in learning how to control depth of field and where to focus to control what's in focus. Hyperfocal distance, if you don't know, is basically a mathematical point that is the best spot to focus to get everything in focus, the closest items to your camera and the furthest away. It revolves around three things. One is your aperture that you're using, the focal length that you're using, and the distance that you're focusing or your subject is. Those three things determine the hyperfocal distance. Now, it's going to take a while to explain hyperfocal distance. So before doing that, without doing that, I should say, look up hyperfocal distance. There's some great applications out there that are free on the internet that you can put on your phone, and you can input some different variables in there and experiment with it. And it'll show you how big is your focus range, what's in focus. And as you experiment with different features and different focal lengths and different subject distances, you'll start to understand how depth of field is. Now, with a wide angle lens, like most of the shots you saw today were pretty much wide angle lenses, the hyperfocal distance is usually like 12 feet away or about 3 yards or 3 meters. And usually focusing there at an aperture of f11 will give you an infinite depth of field, meaning that things for about a foot from your camera are in focus and things to infinity are in focus. Some cases I do some focus stacking in some of my images, and a few of them today were, but in general, most are a single focus point using that hyperfocal distance mentality. Without getting too complicated, because focusing can be, the real easy thing that I tell my students is that you basically focus a third of the way into your scene. So if you have rule of thirds on your camera, wherever that bottom rule of third is resting is generally where you want to be focusing. And that should be about a third of the way into your scene and give you a close to hyperfocal distance point.
You know what? That's a great tip. And I'm a very experienced photographer, but that's a really, really cool tip. Easy tip to remember. Really good.
I keep it easy. I don't think about that distance too much. I just keep it real simple.
Great. What wide angle do you use? How wide a lens do you typically like?
I don't go any wider than a 16. I use a 16 to 35. And I don't have anything wider than that. If I need to go any wider than that, I'll just do a quick pano. It's very rare that I need a 14 millimeter, for example, out in the field. There are some situations where I wish I had it, but they're few and far between. But that 16 to 35 millimeter is really my kit lens. It's what is on my camera most. It's a great landscape focal length, and I think every landscape photographer should have that lens if you don't already.
Great. Actually, someone asked me a question and I didn't see it. And I did actually want to almost pipe in when you were talking about this. There is one aspect of NiSi glass that's really great. I mean, we are here to talk about our filters and they really are good. But there is one thing that's really, really exceptional about them against the competition. And that is that our filters are extremely water resistant and oil resistant. And, how can glass be water resistant? It means that it's coated to actually repel water and to repel oil. So it's very easy to just wipe a NiSi filter with a microfiber cloth and it will be clean. I mean, if you smudge it, just smudge it, but all you have to do is rub it with a microfiber cloth, and 9 times out of 10, it will clean as it can be.
Absolutely. Yeah, I kind of alluded that. It was part of the reason I didn't really mention it, but one of the reasons I was using it during that fall color rainbow shot was that glass grad filter cleans much easier than my lens would. So having that grad in front really helped me to just clean things quick and easy because it just wipes off immediately.
Yeah, it's super cool, and yeah, I'm thrilled using mine. I've never had glass, and I'm like nuts about keeping my glass clean, and I've never been able to keep my glass cleaner than when I started putting this brand of filter on my camera. I'm gonna wrap it up with one more, which is, do you regularly use polarizers when shooting sunrise and sunset?
It depends. Usually, as when you're shooting sunrise or sunset, you're shooting directly at the sun, and that means that the polarizer is going to work as well.
When they're exposing their image and they're previewing their shot is the shadows. And you can't be scared of having a little bit of shadows.
Whoa, I'm hearing myself.
Histogram here, I don't have any black clipping, or my image isn't too dark. There's detail there to be recovered, and as you can see from the histogram here, I don't have.
Sorry, guys. Little technical difficulties. shooting directly at the sun
And as you can see from here,
is basically,
Someone has their mic
technical
on.
difficulties.
yeah,
Shooting directly at the sun.
I hope it's not.
it's weird. We're getting some weird feedback. Sorry, guys. Sorry for the technical. I think we fixed it. The question was using a polarizer, shooting sunrise and sunset. There's a problem with that because you're shooting directly at the sun. You're not 90 degrees from the sun. So it's not going to work as well shooting directly at the sun for sunrise or sunset. Now it can work side lit wise. It works really well during sunrise and sunsets. It'll make the colors pop. But shooting directly at the sun is not going to work as well. I also don't use it a lot seascaping when I'm shooting directly at the sun because it's going to remove the reflected light off of the water, which is kind of what you want during a seascape sunset. You want those bright clouds coming off of the water and reflecting that beautiful color so that you're getting that color pop. Same thing holds true for lake sunsets, for example, if you're not by the beach and you're shooting a body of water, or when I'm in Yosemite and I'm shooting on the Merced River, I don't use a polarizer because I want that reflected light of the beautiful colors to go off of that water and enhance the image. So I don't use a polarizer a lot when I'm shooting directly at the sun, but if I'm shooting 90-degree light, absolutely. It's going to help to make those colors burst.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we did it. So let me take the few people that are, well, there's still quite a few people with us, over 70 people. And let me just remind everyone here not only to follow Chris on Instagram and get in touch with him about some of his workshops, but also that you can use Live 15 Chris for 15% off of virtually all NiSi product except the lens, in case anyone was here at the beginning, and we can't discount the lens, but we can discount all other filters and camera accessories from NiSi, and also our new brand, which is Explorer, which is ball heads, mini tripods, and some camera accessories, including a really fabulous pair of LED and RGB lights, and soon to be a very good line of tripods and other camera accessories. So keep an eye on Explorer Photo and Video. I thank you very much for all of this. Chris, I'm going to sign off, and we'll be in touch tomorrow or the day after. I want to thank you so much for a great webinar, and this is going to be, this has been recorded. It'll be on our NiSi Optics USA YouTube channel. And thank you very much, and take care. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed and look forward to seeing you real soon.
You got it. Bye-bye.